And then he comes back in verse 9. But you're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood. And Peter is coming right out of Exodus 19. In Exodus 19, before the Sinai experience, God says to the people of Israel, you are a kingdom of priests, royal priests. Why have I chosen Israel? To be priests for the world. And Peter says it's taken us 1,400 years, but we've come to the place now where it's possible for a person to really be clean before God through the blood of Jesus Christ, where it's possible now no longer simply to have outward cleanness, but to have inward cleanness. It's possible now to realize the fulfillment of what Moses was talking about 1,400 years ago. We are the house of God. We are the priests. So that, verse 9, you may proclaim the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. Why should you and I be holy? We're priests. And again, Peter knows his Old Testament so well. The priests have two jobs. One is to offer sacrifices on behalf of those who are broken and lost. That's your job. What are those spiritual sacrifices you're offering? In part, they're your prayers. In part, they are you getting your shoulder under the pain and the suffering and the sorrow of those people in your community and saying, here, brother, sister, let's bear them to God. And you see, the priest says, oh God, make me clean enough that I can help this sister to bear this heavy, horrible load and bear it to Jesus. Make me clean enough so that I don't get in the way. Make me clean enough so that she sees Jesus when she comes to the altar and not some filthy-hearted priest. I sanctify myself for their sakes. Why should you be a holy person? Oh, because no one will see heaven without holiness. I'm tempted to use profanity, but I won't. No, for the sake of the world. For the sake of a lost world. You're going into the operating room. You're just sort of fuzzy and muzzy, and in the fog you sort of glance over and you see this guy walking along beside you, and he's got mechanics coveralls on, covered with grease. And in his hand he has a big, rusty butcher knife. And you say, the nurse, why is that man coming into the operating room? And the nurse says, oh, that's your surgeon. I guarantee you, you'd be up off that board on wheels that they've got and down the hall, regardless of that hospital gown exposing parts of you that you don't want exposed. He's not going to operate on me. Do you understand what I'm saying? How are we going to bring the lost to God? With impure, self-serving, divided hearts, where 3/4 of the time we're worrying about our image? How are we going to be priests of the living God with lives like that? No, don't seek holiness for your sake. Don't you dare seek holiness for your sake. Seek holiness for the sake of a lost world. And so that leads him right into this next point. He says then, He sums it up beautifully in a transitional paragraph there in verses 11 and 12. He says, remember, you're pilgrims. And as pilgrims, don't get trapped by inordinate desire. Here it is again. Oftentimes we make evil high and mysterious and philosophical. And C.S. Lewis says in one of his books, at heart it really isn't evil, at heart it's banal. And it's true. It's not high and mysterious and philosophical. It's me wanting sex now. It's me wanting food now. Bloat myself till I'm exploding and then stick my finger down my throat and spew it all up and bloat myself again. That's evil. And Peter says you're a pilgrim. There are swamps in this land we're passing through. Oh, don't fall into any of those quicksands. Why? So that, verse 12, your conduct will be honorable among the Gentiles. And here he's using Gentiles almost certainly in the sense of unbelievers. So that when they speak against you as evildoers, and notice he doesn't say if they speak against you, he says when they speak against you. They will. A fallen world looking at Christians has got to find excuses for why they act that way. Oh, yeah. She talks about love all the time. I know what she's after. Oh, yeah, Mr. Goody-Goody. Now he says, don't give him an excuse. Don't give him an excuse. Live lives that when the hour comes of visitation, see that in verse 12 of chapter 2 there? Everybody is going to have an hour of visitation. Not hospital visitation. Well, there may be that too. But there's going to come an hour when God visits them. When God breaks in upon their lives. And Peter says, oh, for heaven's sake, in that moment when God breaks into their lives, don't let your life be an excuse for them to say, well, it's all a bunch of hooey. I sanctify myself. No, I can't do that. Lord, I pray that you will sanctify me for their sakes. So he says, be submissive. And in this section, then, he names several groups. And I'm going to try to move quickly here. Again, part of my hope here is that you can read your Bible and that with some clues, some things will stand out for you. He says, therefore, here it is again. Now, as I said, if you're not using the New King James, you'll not have a therefore at verse 13. And that's correct as far as it goes. There is no therefore in the Greek. But I think the New King James is correct that there's an implication here. Because you're pilgrims, because you don't mean to get entangled in the quicksands of this world's inordinate desires, because you want a testimony before the Gentile, the unbeliever, therefore, first of all, he says, submit to human government. Verses 13 through 17. Verse 18. Submit to human lords. And that goes all the way through the end of chapter 2, verses 18 through 25. Chapter 3, verse 1. Submit to human husbands. And that goes through verse 6. Submit to human wives. Verse 7. And then in verses 8 through 12, submit to one another. Submit to human governments. Chapter 2, 13 through 17. Submit to human lords. 18 through 25. Submit to human husbands, 3, 1 through 6. Submit to human wives. 3:7. Submit to one another. 3:8 through 12. Now let's talk about this quickly. He says not that human governments are infallible. And I think it's important all the way through here. Peter never says you ought to submit to masters because slavery is a good institution. He doesn't say submit to your husband because oppressive marriage is the way God designed it. He is not justifying any of these. The only one that he begins to justify a bit is government, but even that one he modifies. He's not saying that we ought to submit to these because somehow this is the way he planned in this hierarchical, overlordship, oppressive structure. Not at all. He's saying this is the world as it is. How can you, as a person who longs to win the world, have the best kind of testimony? That's what he's talking about. And so he says, submit yourself to government because government is God's design for suppressing evil and for highlighting good. Now that has some implications. When does a government, in fact, become so perverse that it is highlighting evil and suppressing good? That's the place that Dietrich Bonhoeffer had to come to and say, no, I cannot submit to Hitler's government. But he says the reason for this, verse 15, is that by doing good, you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men as free. And here's the clue in this whole discussion on submission. If I submit because I have to, if I submit because I'm forced into it, it's not going to achieve anything in my heart and probably in yours. No, Peter says, know that you're free in Jesus Christ. And as free persons, then lay aside your rights, just like Jesus laid aside his rights, and he'll talk about that in the next section. But this is the key to submission. Why do I submit to human governments? In order that they will have no excuse for their disbelief, and in order that they will have every reason to believe. Again, do you hear what I say? I hope it's not I hope it's Peter. Why do you and I submit to God's ordinances? In the final analysis, for the sake of the world. Why do you and I submit to human ordinances? In the final analysis, for the sake of the world. Peter says, Christians, be good citizens, insofar as your Christian faith will make that possible, so that by your good behavior you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. And then he goes on to talk about slaves. Once again, please hear me. He is not saying that slavery is an institution designed by God in order to keep clods down. He's not saying that at all, but he's saying if you find yourself slave, then how do you relate to that master? Do you relate to him hostilely, hatefully? Or do you, in fact, for Jesus' sake, take that oppression and give back love? Some years ago when I was working my way through chapters 7 through 11 of Isaiah, I was struck by the fact that over and over and over again in those chapters, you have the child, the child, the child. And I thought, what's going on here? And then it dawned on me. Israel is being faced by the colossus of Assyria, the greatest empire the world had known. Mighty, booted warrior, striding across the world, crushing people under every step. How is God going to confront the arrogance and the pride and the power of a fallen world? And I thought, of course, He's going to come and He's going to be more arrogant. He's going to be more powerful. He's going to crush the Assyrians. For unto us a child is born. A little child shall lead them. He won't put out a smoking wick. He won't break a bent reed. And suddenly it dawned on me, God's power is not the superlative power to crush evil. God's power is the power to swallow up evil. That's power. That's power. And that's the power that He offers to you and to me. That's the power that He calls us to take upon ourselves as we live in the world. And so He says, slave, you find yourself in that situation. There's no hope of your breaking out of it. So how are you going to live in it? Are you going to live with hostility and resistance and hatred? Or are you in fact going to, by the grace of God, absorb the evil that is thrown at you and swallow it up, not into a black hole of self, but into a universe of light? That's power. A number of years ago, a black student stood up in a congregation where I was. Most of us were white. And he said, you can't tell me I have to love some white sadist. And I thought to myself, no, Benny, I guess I can't. I haven't walked where you've walked. I haven't lived in the ghettos of Philadelphia. But later, why is it always later we think of these things? I thought, no, Benny, I can't tell you you have to love him. But I've got good news. You may love him. Oh, Benny, if that white sadist has the power to make you hate him, then he has power over you. You're his slave indeed. But if, no matter what he has done to you, he cannot make you hate him, you can only give back love. You are free. 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 He says your model is Jesus. Jesus who did not come as the booted conqueror. Jesus who did not come as the winner. Oh, we know he won in the end, but he won by losing. Your model, he says, is Jesus, who took the suffering that came upon him. Undeserved. Peter says right throughout here, there are no crowns for deserved suffering. If you've done the wrong thing and get it in the neck, you deserved it. The crowns are for undeserved suffering. And so he says Jesus is our model, who took what was not his by right. See, Jesus could have stood upon his rights. God, Father, I am your equal. You know it. I am just as good as you are in every degree. I am you. You are me. I have my rights. And by God, I don't deserve to be treated like I've been treated. I come to this world that I made, and these self-righteous so-and-sos accuse me of being a sinner. Now, God, I don't have to put up with that. They take the iron that I put in the earth and the tree that I planted, and they nail me to it, God. You can't do that to me. He could have said it, but he didn't. Thank God he didn't. Thank God he didn't. He said, Father, I'd rather not drink this cup. What was he talking about? In the Old Testament, it talks, I'd get to the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, it talks about the sins of the world filling up a cup. And there's that cup brimming over with bitter, sour wine. And worst of all, down in the bottom of it are the dregs, the old grape skins, the residue. I don't know what kids call it now. We used to call it gung. And Jesus is looking into that cup. The sins, the sorrows, the shame, the cruelty, the horror of this world. And he could have said, God, you don't have the right to ask that. I'm as holy as you are. I don't have to take this. And he didn't do it. He said, God, is there anybody else to drink this? And the Father said, no, son. There's nobody else to drink it. And your Jesus and mine said, okay. And I've always loved the picture in John. The rock opera Superstar depicts Jesus in the garden as defeated. Well, God, I never knew it was going to come to this. God, if I'd known, you can believe I never would have gotten into this racket. But I guess I'm backed into it, and I guess I got to do it, so all right, I'll do it. Oh, no. When Jesus came out of the garden with that cup in his hand, here came these guys through the trees, through those old gnarled olive trees. They had their torches, and they were saying, shh, 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 shh. I mean, this guy turned 2,000 devils into pigs. What do you think he could do with us? Shut up, be quiet. We're going to sneak up on him. And Jesus walked out from behind a tree and said, hi, guys, and they fell right back on the ground. They said, shh, 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 shh. We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. I am. Boom, back they go on the ground. That's not a guy who's defeated. That's not a guy who's broken under the labors and the burdens and the sorrows and the horrors of the world. That's not a guy who's saying, well, I'll do it, but I hate it. That's a guy who's free. Forgive me for getting so excited here, but all the world is longing for people who are free. Free to take the sufferings and the sorrows and the shames and the hurts. Not free not to suffer, not free not to carry the shame, not free not to carry the horrors, but free to carry them. So he says, submit yourselves. Not because that oppressive slave master is right, not because he's got some divine right of heaven to do that to you. By no means. Those people didn't have any right to do what they did to Jesus. But no, do it. Do it for Jesus' sake. Do it for his sake. Because, dear God, the only way the sufferings and the sorrows and the shames and the hurts of this world are going to be carried is if we carry them. And if we won't, who will? One of our friends works with teen moms in Chicago. Teenage girls with 2 or 3 children in some cases. She told us in a recent letter that a 17-year-old mother of 2 tried to kill herself on graduation night because her friends were graduating and she was locked in a filthy one-room apartment with 2 screaming kids. And we've sensed in Donna's letters across these years a certain loss of innocence. I think when she got into this, she really thought that everything would be changed about these girls' situations. And some have. Some of the girls have broken out of the cycle, but a lot of them haven't. But I've sensed in Donna across these years a growing willingness to just be Jesus to these girls. Just to come under the load and say, here, is this too big for you to carry? Put some of it on my shoulders. And I'll put some of it on Jesus' shoulders. No, I'll put it all on Jesus' shoulders. And we'll carry it together. What is holiness about? Holiness is not about me being shut in a closet, being righteous. Till we had kids, I was the most holy man in the world. You never saw anybody so patient as me. And we had children, and God said, you need for me to do a little more, don't you? And I said, you better believe it. You better believe it. Holiness is not about being shut in a closet, being righteous. Holiness is about giving ourselves away, letting our image and our victory and our honor be nailed to a cross in order that we can be the kind of priests who can offer up the sacrifices of a world which isn't even sure God is there, that we can declare the praises of God to a people all the strings of whose hearts are broken. Be ye holy. Amen.